He left her at a collapsing cabin, certain she'd come crawling back. But the lake had other plans. The moving truck disappeared down the road, and Marianne Keller stood alone with a ring of old keys in her hand and a German shepherd at her side. The cabin her son called a practical solution leaned toward the water like it was ready to surrender. No heat, no power, no help. Just wind off the lake and a silence thick enough to swallow doubt or awaken something stronger. If you had been in her place that day, would you have turned the key or driven away? Tell me what you honestly think. The maple tree in Marianne Keller's front yard had already begun to turn, its leaves edged in brittle orange despite the lingering warmth of early September. She had planted it the year Eric started kindergarten. It was taller than the roofline now, broad and steady, its branches casting a trembling lace of shadow across the lawn where she stood. The movers didn't look at her. They carried her life past her in square cardboard boxes, labeled in thick black marker. Kitchen, books, linens, misc. As if 42 years in the same house could be reduced to inventory. The front door remained open, its brass hinges whining every time someone pushed through with another armful of furniture. Marianne clasped her hands in front of her, the knuckles pale. Atlas stood beside her, the thick black and tan shepherd's coat gleaming in the sun. His ears were upright, alert, tracking every unfamiliar movement. He didn't bark. He simply watched. Eric stood near the driveway, one hand on his hip, the other holding his phone. He wore pressed khakis and a pale blue button-down shirt, sleeves rolled to his forearms in a way that was meant to look relaxed. He was giving instructions in the same tone he used at work, measured, efficient, impatient. "Careful with that dresser," he called. "It's solid oak." Marianne recognized the dresser. She had polished it every spring. Daniel had built it the year they moved in, sanding the drawers until they slid like silk. Now it was wrapped in gray moving blankets and secured with tape. "For her safety, Mom," Eric said again, turning toward her as if repetition might make it kinder. "You know that's what this is about." She kept her gaze on the maple leaves fluttering overhead. "I've lived here longer than you've been alive." "That's exactly my point." He sighed. "The stairs alone are a liability, and after the fall last winter, I tripped over Atlas," she said quietly. Not the stairs." Atlas shifted at the sound of his name, pressing closer to her leg. Eric's jaw tightened. "You can't keep managing this place alone. It's too much house. The market's strong right now. We'd be foolish not to sell." "We." The word hung there between them. A neighbor across the street paused while collecting her mail. Another man slowed his truck as he drove past, curiosity lingering in his rearview mirror. Marianne felt the weight of their attention, even though no one said a word. "Assisted living isn't what you think," Eric continued. "They've got activities, medical staff on site, social opportunities. It's not some sad nursing home." "And Atlas?" she asked. Eric hesitated. Atlas's low growl rolled from his chest like distant thunder. "They don't allow large breeds," Eric said carefully. "It's policy. Insurance liability." Marianne turned to look at him then. Truly look at him. The crease between his brows, the faint gray at his temples she hadn't noticed before. "He's 8 years old," she said. "He's family. He's a dog, Mom." The growl deepened. Not loud, but deliberate. Eric glanced down at Atlas and stepped back half a pace. "See? That's exactly what I mean. He's unpredictable." "He's protecting me," she replied. "No, he's territorial." The movers carried out the dining table next, Daniel's table. 6 chairs, though most holidays lately it had only been the 2 of them. Marianne swallowed against the tightness in her throat. "You won't need a big table where you're going," Eric added, softer now, as if offering consolation. "Where you're going." The phrase landed like a verdict. Marianne felt something inside her go very still. She had not agreed to any of this. Not really. She had listened while Eric explained the finances, the upkeep, the practicality. She had nodded when he talked about safety and convenience, but no one had asked her what she wanted. Atlas stepped forward suddenly when two movers approached the porch again. His body blocked their path, muscles coiled. "It's okay," Marianne murmured, resting a hand on his head. "It's okay, boy." Eric rubbed his temples. "This is exactly why the facility won't work. They can't have a dog intimidating staff." She lifted her chin. "Then I won't go." Silence settled over the yard. Eric lowered his hand slowly. "Mom, don't do this. I won't go anywhere he isn't allowed." The words surprised even her with their firmness. Eric looked toward the open front door, then back at her. The house behind him echoed, empty rooms already stripped of personality. "You're being unreasonable," he said, though his voice had thinned. "Unreasonable," she repeated. "For once," he pressed, "can you think practically?" She almost laughed. She had spent 30 years as a librarian managing budgets so small they could barely afford replacement textbooks. She had learned to stretch, to plan, to improvise. Practicality had been her survival. Eric exhaled sharply and pulled a folded envelope from his back pocket. "Fine," he said. "If you won't go to assisted living, there's another option." She didn't reach for it. "You remember the old cabin? Up on North Shore Lake? Dad's place." Her heart skipped. Daniel's cabin. "It's still technically yours," Eric continued. "Oh, no mortgage. No property taxes worth mentioning. It's remote. But it's a roof." "A roof," she echoed. "It's been vacant for years," he admitted. "Needs work. But if you insist on keeping the dog, you could stay there." Marianne imagined it instantly. The narrow gravel road, the pine trees leaning over the shoreline, Daniel sketching improvements on yellow legal pads. "You think I'll last a week?" she said. Eric didn't answer. The silence answered for him. "It's safer than this house," he insisted finally. "No stairs, one floor. Peaceful." "And you won't have to worry about me," she said. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Atlas sat down at her feet, calm now, eyes fixed on Eric as if memorizing him. Marianne took the envelope. Inside was a set of old keys and a photocopy of a deed bearing Daniel's name. But the movers carried the last box to the truck. The front door stood open behind them, hollow and echoing. Eric checked his watch. "I'll have the truck meet you there tomorrow. Just think about it tonight." Marianne looked once more at the maple tree, at the house that had held birthdays and arguments and quiet Sunday mornings. Then she looked at her son. "You've already made your decision," she said. He didn't deny it. The truck engine roared to life. Tape fluttered loose from a box corner. Neighbors retreated into their homes. Eric turned toward his car, then paused. "Mom," he said, not meeting her eyes. "This is for your own good." She watched him drive away. Atlas leaned into her leg, steady and warm. For the first time in her life, Marianne Keller stood on her own lawn and felt like a visitor. Not in my house anymore. Oh, the words lingered as Marianne stood alone in the yard long after the moving truck and Eric's sedan disappeared around the bend. The maple leaves rustled overhead, indifferent witnesses. Atlas pressed against her thigh, steady as a pillar. She didn't go back inside. There was nothing inside to return to. By dusk, the house felt like a shell, echoing, stripped of its warmth. She slept that night on a borrowed air mattress in what had once been her bedroom, the walls pale where furniture had stood for decades. Atlas lay beside her, head lifted at every unfamiliar sound. In the morning, she packed what remained: a suitcase of clothes, Daniel's framed photograph, a small stack of library books she had never returned to the donation bin, and Atlas's worn leather collar. The keys to the cabin rested on the kitchen counter until she picked them up last. The drive north felt longer than she remembered. The highway narrowed into a 2-lane road bordered by pine and birch. Gas stations thinned out. The air sharpened, cooler near the water. Atlas shifted in the passenger seat, nose lifted toward the open window as if he recognized the scent of lake wind and damp earth. Marianne kept both hands firm on the steering wheel. She had only been to the cabin a handful of times after Daniel bought it. Back then, it had been a project he talked about in the evenings, fixing the dock, rebuilding the porch, maybe even retiring there someday. But life had continued in town. Work, school board meetings, Eric's baseball games. Daniel's sudden heart attack had ended the plans before they began. Well, the gravel road appeared almost without warning, a narrow ribbon cutting through thick woods. The tires crunched loudly beneath her sedan. Branches brushed the car as she crept forward. Atlas sat upright now. When the cabin finally came into view, she felt the breath leave her chest. It leaned. Not dramatically, but enough that the sag was unmistakable. The porch roof dipped toward one corner where a support beam had rotted. One shutter hung loose, swinging slightly in the wind. Moss crept along the shingles like slow green fire. The dock at the water's edge listed sideways, one post half submerged, boards warped and gray. The lake itself was calm, wide and indifferent beneath a pale sky. Marianne stepped out of the car slowly. The silence was different from town silence. It wasn't distant traffic and lawnmowers. It was wind through tall grass, a crow somewhere deeper in the trees, the faint lap of water against broken planks. Atlas circled once, then twice, nose working furiously. She approached the porch, each step deliberate. The wooden boards groaned under her weight. When she turned the key in the front door, it resisted before giving way with a brittle click. The smell met her first. Dust, damp wood, old insulation, the faint sour trace of animals that had found shelter during empty winters. Sunlight filtered through cracked windows, illuminating floating particles in the air. The couch Daniel once dragged inside sat collapsed in the middle, cushions torn. A section of ceiling near the far wall had caved in, leaving debris scattered across the floor. The kitchen sink hung at an angle, its pipe detached. There was no hum of electricity, or no flicker of light. She tried the faucet anyway. Nothing. Atlas patted inside cautiously, nails clicking against warped boards. He moved from room to room, alert but not afraid. Eric's words echoed in her mind. It's remote. But it's a roof that sagged. She walked toward the back door that opened to the lake. The handle came off in her hand. She stared at it for a moment, before setting it down carefully on a dusty table. "This was your idea," she murmured, not sure whether she meant Eric or Daniel. The wind pushed through the broken window, stirring the curtains, what remained of them. Her phone showed one faint bar of service, then none. She stepped back outside and turned slowly in a circle. The trees were thick, the nearest cabin barely visible through brush. No cars passed. No neighbors peered from behind curtains. Atlas returned to her side and sat, looking up at her face. She imagined Eric pulling into his tidy driveway in town. Climate-controlled office tomorrow. Coffee waiting in the break room. No rotting beams to worry about. He expected a phone call within days. She could almost hear it. "Mom, this isn't sustainable." The porch creaked again under her shifting weight. The dock groaned as a small wave struck it. Marianne walked down toward the shoreline. Up close, the damage looked worse. Boards were split clean through. One support beam leaned outward as if exhausted from holding too much weight. The waterline had eaten away at the earth beneath it. Daniel had once stood here, hands on hips, imagining improvements. "We'll fix this up," he'd said, smiling at the lake as though it were a challenge he intended to win. She crouched slowly, fingers brushing the cold wood of the dock. The grain felt brittle beneath her touch. Atlas barked once, sharp, not aggressive. She turned. He stood near the edge of the tree line, ears forward, scanning the woods. "You like it here?" she asked quietly. He looked back at her, tail low but steady. A gust of wind cut across the lake, lifting her hair and carrying the scent of pine and water. It was beautiful, and completely unlivable. She walked back to the car and opened the trunk. A suitcase, a cooler with sandwiches, 2 blankets, Atlas's food bag. Nothing more. No generator, no tools, no plan. Eric had assumed she would see this place and surrender. She imagined calling him now. "Come get me." The thought tasted bitter. Instead, she shut the trunk and locked the car. When she returned to the porch, she stood very still. The cabin leaned. The windows were broken. The dock was half gone. It was not a sanctuary. It was a ruin. Eric had handed her the keys with quiet confidence. A gesture disguised as compromise. A solution he believed would solve itself once she realized how impossible it was. Atlas climbed the porch steps beside her and sat squarely at the door. Marianne placed her palm against the rough wood of the cabin wall. "I'm still standing," she whispered, not to the cabin, but to herself. She stepped inside once more, closing the door behind her despite the cracked frame. It didn't seal properly. The wind still slipped through, but she was inside. And for now, that was enough. The wind never really stopped. It slipped through cracks in the cabin walls and rattled what remained of the shutters, on a restless whisper that made the whole structure seem uncertain of its own balance. Marianne stood in the middle of the living room, if it could still be called that, and listened to the hollow sound of emptiness. There was no safe place to sit. The couch sagged toward the broken floorboard beneath it. A thin shaft of daylight fell through the gap in the ceiling where part of the roof had collapsed, illuminating splintered wood and old insulation that looked like gray cotton. Atlas paced in slow, deliberate circles. She moved carefully from room to room, testing each plank before shifting her weight. In the bedroom, the mattress had been dragged upright against the wall, chewed through in places. In the small bathroom, the sink was detached and the mirror clouded with moisture stains. No running water, no power, no heat. Now she returned to the doorway and looked out at the lake again. The sun was lowering now, turning the surface into a sheet of molten copper. It was beautiful in a way that made her chest ache. Beautiful and useless. Atlas stopped near the doorway, ears pricked toward the tree line. "What is it?" she asked softly. He didn't bark. He simply stood watchful, as if evaluating the woods as a possible threat. The temperature dropped quickly after sunset. Marianne gathered the 2 blankets from the trunk of her car and spread one across the back seat. The sedan had always felt cramped on long drives. Now it would have to be a bedroom. She paused before closing the trunk. The cabin loomed in front of her, darkening, unlit, skeletal. She tried the front door once more, pushing it firmly into place and wedging a small rock near the bottom so it wouldn't swing open. It was a small gesture of control. Atlas climbed into the back seat first, circling twice before settling. Marianne slid in beside him, pulling the second blanket over both of them. The silence settled heavier once the sun disappeared completely. In town, night had meant distant headlights passing, porch lights glowing in neighboring yards. Here, darkness swallowed everything beyond the windshield. The trees became silhouettes. The lake disappeared entirely. The first sound came from inside the cabin. A slow creak. Wood adjusting to cooling air. She stiffened. Atlas's head lifted instantly, eyes alert, ears angled forward. "It's just the house," she whispered, though her own voice sounded unconvincing. And a branch scraped against the roof. Then another. Something knocked softly against the side of the cabin. Atlas let out a low rumble. Marianne reached down and wrapped her fingers in the fur at his neck. His warmth seeped into her palms. "You're supposed to protect me," she murmured, attempting a faint smile. He shifted closer. The wind picked up again, and the trees answered in restless sighs. The sound moved across the water in long, wavering waves. The sedan rocked faintly with each stronger gust. Her phone had no signal now. She checked it anyway. Nothing. The air inside the car grew cold enough that her breath fogged faintly against the window. She tucked the blanket tighter around her shoulders. Eric's face appeared in her mind. His tightened expression, the certainty in his voice. "You can't manage this alone." Well, she swallowed. Perhaps he was right. Her hands ached already from the short inspection earlier. Her knees had protested every time she crouched near the dock. The cabin needed more than sweeping and cleaning. It needed reconstruction. She closed her eyes. She could still call him tomorrow. Say she'd tried. Say it wasn't safe. Atlas shifted again, pressing his head against her ribs. Outside, something moved through the brush, quick, light steps over dry leaves. Her eyes snapped open. "Shh," she whispered instinctively. Atlas's ears were rigid now, tracking the direction of the sound. He didn't bark, he listened. The movement circled briefly, then faded toward the lake. Probably a deer. She let out a slow breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The cabin groaned once more, louder this time, and a board somewhere gave a hollow knock. The car suddenly felt very small. Her entire world had narrowed to metal doors and fogged windows. She thought of the house in town, the sturdy staircase, the familiar hum of the refrigerator at night, the soft glow of the porch light she always left on. Not in my house anymore. The words replayed like an echo, bouncing between memory and present reality. A tear slid down her cheek before she could stop it. She brushed it away impatiently. "I'm not fragile," she whispered into the dark. Atlas lifted his head and licked her wrist once, slow and deliberate. Midnight came without ceremony. The wind grew colder, sharper. The lake slapped harder against the ruined dock, boards clacking in uneven rhythm. She tried to sleep. Every time her eyes closed, as a new sound broke the silence, a twig snapping, a faint rustle along the cabin wall, the low moan of shifting timber. She imagined raccoons squeezing through gaps, mice nesting beneath the floor, the possibility of something larger. Atlas remained vigilant. Once, around what must have been 2 a.m, he sat upright and stared intently at the cabin door. Her pulse quickened. They both listened. Nothing moved. After several long seconds, he relaxed again, resting his chin on her knee. Eventually, exhaustion won. Her thoughts slowed. The sounds blurred together into a distant rhythm. She drifted in and out of shallow sleep, never fully surrendering. Just before dawn, the wind calmed. A faint gray light crept across the lake, outlining the crooked shape of the cabin in soft relief. But Marianne opened her eyes to cold air and stiff muscles. Atlas was already awake, watching the shoreline. The night had not swallowed them. The cabin still stood. She pushed herself upright slowly, joints protesting. The world looked different in morning light, less threatening, more fragile. Mist hovered low over the water. Birds began their quiet morning calls. She stepped out of the car and inhaled deeply. The air was sharp but clean. The cabin, though broken, no longer felt like an enemy. It looked tired instead. Atlas jumped down beside her and stretched. For the first time since arriving, Marianne noticed how quiet the woods truly were once the wind stopped. No engines, no distant doors closing, only the steady pulse of nature. She rubbed her arms briskly against the chill. "I'm still here," she said softly. Atlas wagged his tail once. The first night had not defeated her, but doubt lingered like the cold in her bones. She looked toward the sagging porch and wondered how many nights like that she could survive. The lake shimmered faintly in the rising light. The day was waiting. Marianne stood beside the car, her breath thin in the morning chill, and watched the mist drift low across the water. The fear that had wrapped around her the night before hadn't disappeared, but it had loosened. Daylight had a way of exposing exaggerations. Atlas nudged her hand. "I know," she said quietly. "We can't sit out here forever." She unlocked the cabin door again. In the clear light of morning, the damage looked less like a threat and more like a problem to be studied. The sagging ceiling, the split beams, the scattered debris. Now, problems could be understood. Problems could be solved. She opened every cracked window she could manage, letting fresh air push out the stale odor. Dust lifted in soft clouds when she dragged the broken couch to one side. Her joints protested, but she paced herself, steady and methodical. The same rhythm she'd used for decades, shelving books and reorganizing cluttered storage rooms at the library. Atlas roamed the perimeter, nose down. She found an old broom leaning in a corner and began sweeping carefully around the collapsed section of ceiling. Wood fragments scraped across the floor in uneven strokes. "Daniel," she muttered, glancing upward at the hole in the roof. "You left me quite a project." Atlas suddenly stopped near the far wall. His ears lifted. He sniffed once, then twice, long, focused draws of air. "What is it?" she asked. He pawed at a warped section of floor near the back of the living room. The wood creaked under his weight. He stepped back and pawed again, harder this time. "Careful," she warned instinctively. But Atlas lowered his shoulder and pushed at the loose board with surprising force. The plank shifted. Marianne froze. She stepped closer, crouching slowly. The board had separated slightly from the one beside it. There was a dark seam beneath. "Did something crawl under there?" she whispered. Atlas huffed and pawed again. She fetched a flathead screwdriver from a rusted toolbox near the kitchen sink, one of the few items still intact, and wedged it gently into the gap. The wood lifted with resistance, nails whining softly as they loosened. Beneath the board was a shallow cavity between floor joists, and inside it, tucked carefully against one beam, was a rectangular metal tin, dull with age, but intact. She stared at it. Atlas sat back on his haunches, as if presenting a trophy. Marianne reached down and pulled the tin free. It was heavier than she expected. She brushed off a layer of dust with her sleeve. The lid bore faint scratches, but no lock. Her fingers trembled slightly as she pried it open. Inside lay a stack of small spiral notebooks bound with elastic bands. A carpenter's pencil rested along one edge. Beneath them were folded sheets of graph paper yellowed with time. She recognized Daniel's handwriting instantly. Firm, deliberate strokes she had watched fill grocery lists and birthday cards for 40 years. Her throat tightened. She sat down carefully on the cleared section of floor and opened the first notebook. Dates from nearly 12 years ago filled the top corners of pages. Sketches of the cabin's foundation, diagrams of beam reinforcements, detailed measurements for rebuilding the porch supports, notes about roof pitch adjustments. She flipped to the next page. Hand-drawn shoreline cross-sections labeled erosion correction. Arrows indicated water flow during heavy storms. Suggestions for sandbag placement and timber anchoring. He had mapped out how to protect the dock from seasonal surges. Atlas leaned forward, nose brushing the page as if reading along. "He never told me he'd done all this," she murmured. She found another notebook, this one labeled simply Phase 2. Inside were plans to rebuild the dock entirely, reinforce its posts with deeper set anchors, replace boards with salvaged cedar. There were supply lists written in the margins, calculations about material costs. Daniel hadn't bought the cabin as an afterthought. He had envisioned something here, something unfinished. Marianne ran her fingers slowly over the pencil marks. She could almost see him sitting at the kitchen table years ago, glasses sliding down his nose as he drafted these pages in quiet concentration. "You were planning to fix it," she whispered. Atlas thumped his tail once against the floor. She turned another page and found something that stopped her completely. A rough timeline. Year 1, structural stabilization. Year 2, dock rebuild. Year 3, community access platform. Community access platform. She blinked. Daniel had drawn a wider deck extension off the dock, labeled reading platform with a question mark. Her breath caught, and he had written in the margin, "Marianne would love this." She pressed her lips together. The cabin wasn't random. It wasn't a last resort option Eric had handed her in quiet dismissal. It had been Daniel's unfinished dream, and somehow, despite everything, it had circled back to her. Atlas shifted closer, his head resting briefly against her shoulder. She closed the notebook gently and stared around the room again. The sagging ceiling, the cracked beams, they weren't symbols of failure. They were instructions waiting to be followed. She stood slowly, gripping the notebook firmly. "Well," she said under her breath, "I suppose we start with Phase 1. Atlas barked once, sharp and bright. The sound echoed differently in daylight, less hollow, more alive. But Marianne carried the tin to the kitchen counter and spread the pages out carefully. She studied Daniel's drawings with focused attention, tracing lines with her finger. Measurements, angles, reinforcement points. The panic from the night before began to recede, replaced by something steadier. A plan. She stepped outside and looked at the porch supports, comparing them to the sketches. The damage matched exactly what Daniel had predicted, rot at the base where water collected. He had drawn arrows pointing to those precise weak spots. "You saw this coming," she said quietly. Atlas trotted down toward the dock, sniffing at the eroded shoreline. She followed him. The water lapped softly at the uneven edge where soil had worn away. Daniel's diagrams showed how to redirect runoff using timber braces and stone barriers, and she folded one of the pages carefully and slipped it into her jacket pocket. Eric had expected despair. He had expected surrender. Instead, she felt something rising in her chest that had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with memory. This wasn't about proving him wrong. It was about finishing something that had been left incomplete. Atlas looked back at her from the edge of the dock, tail swaying. "You found it," she said softly. He wagged once, satisfied. The cabin still leaned. The roof was still damaged, but the ruin no longer felt like a trap. It felt like an invitation. And for the first time since she stood on her front lawn watching movers carry her life away, Marianne Keller did not feel discarded. She felt necessary. The feeling did not erase the cold air or the splintered beams overhead. Yes, it did not fix the broken dock or restore electricity, but it changed the way she looked at the damage. Damage was no longer an insult. It was instruction. She spent the morning studying Daniel's notebooks at the small kitchen counter, brushing aside old leaves and bits of plaster to make space. His handwriting steadied her. Measurements written in margins. Arrows pointing to weak joints. Lists titled Phase 1, Stabilize before winter. Stabilize, she repeated aloud. Atlas lay nearby, chin resting on his paws, watching her with quiet focus. By midday, she drove back toward town. The gravel road rattled beneath the sedan, and dust rose behind her like smoke. Her list, written carefully on a torn sheet of notebook paper, sat folded in her purse. Lumber brackets, galvanized nails, heavy tarp, work gloves, sandbags. As the hardware store stood on Main Street between a bait shop and a closed diner, the bell above the door chimed when she entered. Tom Alvarez looked up from behind the counter. He was in his late 50s, broad-shouldered, with a permanent crease between his eyebrows from years of squinting at measuring tape. "Morning," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. "What can I help you with?" Marianne stepped forward, unfolding her list. "I need some structural brackets, 4-inch galvanized, and heavy tarp, the thick kind." Tom glanced at her over his glasses. "Big project?" "Old cabin up on North Shore." His expression shifted slightly. "Keller place?" "Yes." He let out a low whistle. "That thing's been sitting empty for years. I've noticed." He walked her through the aisles, pulling items from shelves with easy familiarity. While she studied each piece carefully, comparing it to Daniel's sketches in her mind. "You doing the work yourself?" Tom asked casually. "Yes." He paused. "You got help?" "I have Atlas." Tom raised an eyebrow. "My dog," she clarified. He gave a short laugh, not unkind. "Well, that's something." She paid in cash, sliding bills across the counter without hesitation. The total made her stomach tighten briefly, but she did not show it. "Storm season's coming early this year," Tom added as he handed her the receipt. "Lake's been unpredictable." "I've noticed that too." He watched her carry the supplies toward the door. "If you need advice, Chisel," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "I'm usually here." "Thank you." When she returned to the cabin, Atlas leapt from the car with renewed energy. He trotted to the porch and barked once, as if announcing the beginning of something official. She started with the porch supports. Daniel's notes had predicted rot at the base, where water collected beneath the beams. She knelt carefully, testing the wood with the screwdriver. It sank in too easily. "Not today," she muttered. Removing the worst section took nearly an hour. Her hands trembled from the effort. Twice she had to sit back on her heels and let the ache in her fingers settle. She wrapped strips of cloth around the hammer handle to soften the grip. Atlas stayed close but out of the way, watching each movement. When the new bracket slid into place and the beam straightened slightly, she felt a surge of quiet satisfaction. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't perfect. But it held. She wiped sweat from her forehead with the back of her sleeve. But the sun had climbed higher now, warming the air just enough to ease the stiffness in her joints. She moved next to the interior floorboard, where Atlas had uncovered the tin. The surrounding boards were weak. Daniel had circled that section in his notes with a penciled warning. "Reinforce before winter freeze." She measured twice, hammered once, then again. Each strike echoed through the cabin. The sound did not feel hollow anymore. By late afternoon, she had cleared nearly half the living room of debris. She stacked usable wood in one corner, separating it from the rotted scraps. Atlas occasionally dragged smaller pieces into a neat pile, tail wagging with surprising seriousness. "You think you're foreman now?" she asked. He barked softly. She laughed, an unexpected sound in the dusty room. The shoreline came next. Daniel's erosion sketches guided her movements. She filled sandbags with soil from higher ground, hauling them one by one toward the edge of the water. Her arms shook with the strain. She paced herself, resting after every 2 bags. The lake was calm now, but the uneven bank told a different story. Atlas patrolled the perimeter, occasionally nudging a bag closer to its proper position with his nose. When she finally stepped back to assess the line of sandbags and timber braces, she felt a flicker of something deeper than determination. Momentum. That evening, she returned to town for more supplies. Nails she had underestimated, a second tarp, thicker rope. Tom noticed. "Back already?" he said. "Underestimated the nails." He studied her for a moment. "You're serious about this?" "Yes." Word traveled quickly in small towns. When she stepped outside, she noticed 2 men near the bait shop watching her load lumber into her sedan. "That the librarian?" one of them murmured. "Rebuilding that wreck," the other replied. She pretended not to hear. By the 3rd day, her rhythm settled into place. Morning inspection, reinforcement, shoreline work, short breaks with water and a sandwich from the cooler. Evenings reviewing Daniel's notes by lantern light. Her hands blistered despite the gloves. Her shoulders ached deeply each night. But the cabin's posture changed incrementally. The porch sagged less. The floor felt firmer underfoot. Atlas became more than company. He alerted her to loose boards by pawing at them. Once, he barked sharply when she stepped too close to a weakened edge of the dock, stopping her just before a plank gave way beneath her weight. "Oh, good catch," she said, crouching to scratch behind his ears. The wind carried the scent of pine and lake water across the porch. She stood one evening and looked out over the shoreline. It was not restored, but it was no longer collapsing. In town, the whispers grew clearer. "Marianne Keller's fixing that place herself. She'll wear herself out. Should have taken the facility." She heard fragments during her supply runs. She did not respond. When the sun dipped below the trees and the lake turned violet in the fading light, she sat on the repaired porch beam and flexed her aching fingers. Atlas settled beside her, leaning into her hip. The cabin still needed more work than she could complete in a month. But it was no longer a ruin waiting to swallow her. It was something under construction. And so was she. But the morning Eric arrived, the lake was flat and silver under a low ceiling of clouds. Marianne had just finished securing a new tarp over the section of roof Daniel had marked as vulnerable. The tarp snapped lightly in the wind, but held firm against the reinforced beam she had installed 3 days earlier. Atlas was the first to notice the approaching vehicle. He lifted his head from where he'd been lying on the porch and let out a single sharp bark. Marianne straightened slowly, wiping her hands on a rag tucked into her back pocket. She followed his gaze down the gravel road. A dark sedan crept forward carefully, tires crunching through the dust. Eric stepped out before the engine had fully settled. He paused beside his car and looked up at the cabin. His expression shifted in stages: recognition, surprise, calculation. The porch no longer sagged visibly. The worst debris had been cleared from the yard. The shoreline bracing stood in neat rows along the bank. It wasn't beautiful, but it wasn't collapsing either. Marianne walked down the steps to meet him halfway. "You found it," she said calmly. "I wasn't sure you'd answer your phone," he replied, glancing at the cabin again. "No service up here." "There isn't." He studied her face. Dirt streaked her cheek, her sleeves were rolled up. A faint bruise darkened one forearm where a board had slipped earlier in the week. "You look—" He hesitated. "Alive?" she suggested. He didn't smile. "I had a meeting in town," he said. "I thought I'd check in." Atlas descended the porch steps slowly and positioned himself beside Marianne, body relaxed but deliberate. His eyes fixed on Eric. Eric shifted his weight. "You've been busy," he observed. Yes. He walked past her toward the porch without waiting for an invitation. His shoes left clean impressions in the dirt Marianne had been leveling. Inside the cabin, he paused again. The floorboards were no longer visibly loose. The ceiling tarp muted the open gap overhead. A stack of organized lumber leaned neatly against one wall. "You did this?" he asked. "I followed instructions." "What instructions?" She pointed to the counter where Daniel's notebooks lay open. Eric approached them cautiously, flipping through pages. He recognized the handwriting immediately. "Dad planned all this?" "He never got the chance." Eric looked around the room again. "You can't seriously think you can finish this alone," he said, tone tightening. "Mom, this is structural work." "Oh, it's dangerous. I'm reinforcing what needs reinforcing. And if something collapses?" "It hasn't." His jaw clenched. "You're being stubborn." Atlas took one deliberate step forward. Not threatening, just present. Eric glanced down at the dog. "See? This is exactly what I mean. You've put yourself in the middle of nowhere with a collapsing building and a dog as your only backup." "He's done more backup than you realize," she replied quietly. Eric exhaled sharply and walked toward the back door, pushing it open. He stepped onto the dock. Marianne followed. The lake rippled gently against the repaired shoreline. He crouched and pressed a hand against one of the sandbags. "You did this?" "Yes." "You could have gotten hurt." "I didn't." He stood again and looked across the water, then back at the cabin. "You think this proves something?" he asked finally. She met his gaze steadily. "It proves I'm not done." Eric rubbed the back of his neck. "This isn't practical," he said. "Winter's coming. What happens when the temperature drops? When the lake freezes? You don't have insulation. No heating system worth mentioning." "I'm working on it." "You're 67. And?" His frustration flickered openly now. "And this isn't a retirement hobby. This is survival. You don't have the savings to pour into this forever." "I'm not pouring," she said evenly. "I'm rebuilding." Atlas moved between them, not pushing, just standing tall. Eric stepped back unconsciously. "I didn't bring you here to fail," he said more quietly. "I thought you'd see the condition and realize it wasn't feasible." She nodded once. "Oh, that was the point." He didn't answer. The silence between them stretched. Wind skimmed across the water. "I'm not your project to manage," she said at last. Eric looked down at his shoes, dust clinging to the polished leather. "I just didn't want you getting hurt," he said, though the words felt incomplete even to him. She considered him carefully. "I know." They stood there, suspended between argument and understanding. Finally, Eric cleared his throat. "You need real help. Contractors. Structural engineers." "I can't afford contractors." "That's exactly what I'm saying." She folded her arms, not defensive, but firm. "I didn't ask you to fund it." He hesitated again. Atlas let out a low huff and sat down squarely between them. Eric looked at the dog, then back at his mother. "You look thinner," he said abruptly. I've been working. This isn't a solution. It's not a surrender either." The words hung in the air. Eric's gaze softened briefly, then hardened again. "If this becomes unsafe, I'm stepping in," he said. "You already did," she replied. He turned toward his car without another word. Atlas watched him closely, but did not bark. As the sedan disappeared back down the gravel road, the cabin felt quieter than before. Marianne stood still for a long moment. The visit had shaken something, not her resolve, but the fragile balance she had built. He had expected failure. He had come prepared to rescue. Instead, he had seen progress. She returned to the porch and sat heavily on the reinforced beam. Atlas climbed up beside her. "You handled that well," she murmured. He leaned against her thigh. The clouds thickened overhead, dimming the light across the lake. She flexed her aching fingers and looked at the structure around her. For the first time since arriving, doubt did not whisper from inside. It echoed from outside, and it sounded like her son's voice. The sky held that gray weight for 3 days. Wind pressed steadily across the lake, flattening its surface until it looked like stretched steel. Marianne watched the weather shift the way Daniel used to, studying cloud movement, the direction of gusts, the way the shoreline grasses leaned. Atlas grew restless. On the fourth morning, rain arrived without ceremony. A steady curtain at first, then thicker, louder. By afternoon, it hammered the tarp over the roof in a relentless rhythm. Marianne stood beneath the porch and watched the lake swell. The sandbags she'd stacked along the bank darkened as water crept closer. The soil near the edge softened under her boots. Daniel's notebook lay open on the kitchen counter, pages weighted down with a wrench. She had studied the section labeled Storm Surge Strategy so many times the pencil grooves felt etched into her memory. If water rises above baseline level, reinforce at points A and C, redirect runoff from roofline, secure dock posts before lateral shift. She stepped back outside, rain soaking through her jacket almost instantly. Atlas followed without hesitation. "Not too far," she warned him, though her own voice was swallowed by wind. The lake no longer lapped gently. It struck. The dock groaned as waves slapped against its weakened supports. One of the older boards lifted slightly, was clapping against the frame like loose teeth. She moved quickly toward the shoreline brace nearest the northern edge, the section Daniel had marked as most vulnerable to lateral erosion. Water was already seeping beneath the bottom sandbag. "Not yet," she muttered. She dragged 2 more filled bags from the porch, heavy and slick, and positioned them at the base of the timber brace. Her boots sank into mud with each step. Atlas barked sharply. She looked up. A stronger gust tore across the lake, bending the trees backward. The tarp snapped violently overhead. "Inside," she ordered instinctively. He didn't move. Instead, he ran toward the far end of the dock. "Atlas!" He planted himself near one of the older support posts and barked again, short, urgent bursts. Marianne followed, heart pounding. The post was shifting. The water struck the side of the dock in diagonal waves, forcing the beam outward inch by inch. The erosion beneath it had deepened overnight. Daniel's sketch flashed through her mind. Deeper set anchors, cross-bracing reinforcement. She dropped to her knees in the mud and examined the base. "If that goes," she whispered, "the whole side goes." Rain blurred her vision. Her fingers fumbled for the rope she'd purchased earlier in the week. She looped it around the support beam and pulled with everything she had, tying it off to the reinforced timber brace she'd installed days earlier. Atlas stood directly beside her, bracing against the wind as if lending weight. The rope strained. The dock shuddered. "Hold," she murmured, not sure whether she was speaking to the wood or herself. The lake rose another inch. When water spilled over the first sandbag and rushed toward the base of the porch, she scrambled back toward the cabin and grabbed the remaining bags, stacking them in a staggered pattern exactly as Daniel's cross-section diagram had shown. Rain plastered her hair to her forehead. Mud coated her jeans. Atlas barked again, this time toward the tree line. She turned. Water runoff from higher ground was rushing downhill in a narrow stream, cutting through the soil behind the cabin. If that stream deepened, it would undermine the foundation from the rear. She ran, faster than her knees appreciated, toward the back corner of the cabin. Using the shovel she'd leaned against the wall earlier, she carved a shallow trench to redirect the flow sideways toward a lower patch of ground. Her breath came in ragged pulls. Atlas stood at the edge of the forming trench, watching the water shift course. It worked. The stream curved away from the foundation. Another gust tore across the lake. A crack split the air, one of the trees near the shoreline bending dangerously under wind pressure before snapping backward. The dock groaned again. Marianne staggered back toward it. The rope she'd tied held firm, but the post continued to lean slightly. She added a secondary brace, wedging a salvaged timber beam beneath the underside of the dock, hammering it into position with shaking hands. Each strike felt like it echoed across the entire lake. By late afternoon, the rain intensified further. The lake breached the top sandbag. Water surged against the reinforced shoreline. Atlas began pacing again, eyes scanning the shifting ground. "Oh, you're okay," she said breathlessly, though she wasn't certain of it herself. The storm did not let up until nightfall. Inside the cabin, the tarp overhead snapped violently, but did not tear. The reinforced beam held steady beneath it. Marianne lit the lantern and sat at the small table, boots caked in drying mud. Her hands trembled, not from fear now, but from exhaustion. Atlas lay at her feet, still alert. Another crash sounded from outside. She stepped to the doorway and shone the lantern toward the dock. It was still there, leaning, strained, but intact. Across the lake, distant lights flickered. She could barely make out the silhouette of another shoreline cabin farther down, water pooling around its porch steps. Eric's house was not on this side of the lake, but she knew enough about the region's elevation patterns to understand what rising water could do. The rain finally began to ease just after midnight. The wind softened into tired gusts. Marianne did not sleep. She checked the shoreline every hour, lantern in hand, boots sinking into mud each time she stepped outside. Atlas followed without question. At dawn, the storm had passed. The lake remained high, unnaturally so, but the surface had stilled. The dock stood at an angle but had not detached. The sandbag line, though battered, remained in place. The trench behind the cabin redirected the runoff exactly as Daniel's notebook had predicted. She stood in soaked clothing and stared at the shoreline. A car approached slowly down the gravel road mid-morning. Then another. Neighbors. They stepped out carefully, boots splashing through pooled water near the entrance. Tom Alvarez was among them. He surveyed the shoreline, eyes wide. "You're the only one that didn't lose half your bank," he said quietly. She followed his gaze across the water. Sections of neighboring docks had collapsed. One cabin porch leaned visibly toward the lake. Tom shook his head. "You reinforced this yourself?" "Yes." He crouched near the sandbags, studying the placement. "Smart layout," he muttered. "Who told you to stagger like this?" "My husband," she replied. Tom stood slowly. "Well," he said, glancing around at the intact cabin and steady porch, "whatever you did, it worked." Marianne looked down at Atlas, who sat calmly beside her, muddy and proud. The lake remained high. The damage elsewhere was undeniable, but the cabin, Daniel's unfinished project, was Eric's supposed last resort, still stood, and so did she. The morning after the storm felt almost unreal. The sky had cleared into a pale blue, as if the violence of the night before had been a rumor instead of a memory. Sunlight skimmed across the swollen lake, catching debris that floated near the far shoreline. Broken planks, a plastic chair, what looked like the remains of someone's dock railing. Marianne stood at the water's edge, boots still caked with drying mud, and took it in slowly. Her shoreline held. The sandbags sagged but remained aligned. The timber braces leaned under pressure but did not crack. The dock tilted, rope taut against the reinforced beam, but it had not detached. Atlas walked the length of the dock carefully, testing each board before placing his weight. "Easy," she called. He paused, and then continued with measured steps, as if inspecting their work. A small group of neighbors had gathered near the entrance to her gravel road. Word traveled quickly when storms passed through lakeside towns. Damage assessments became a communal ritual. Tom Alvarez approached first, hands shoved into his jacket pockets. "Lost half of Jenkins's dock down the way," he said quietly, "and the Myers place had water inside the back room." Marianne nodded. He surveyed her shoreline again, crouching to examine the trench she'd dug behind the cabin. "That redirect held," he observed. "Yes. You didn't panic." "I didn't have time to." He gave her a sideways look, half impressed, half thoughtful. A woman Marianne vaguely recognized from town stepped closer, arms crossed against the lingering chill. You stayed here through all that?" she asked. "Yes." "Alone?" Marianne glanced down at Atlas. "Not entirely." The woman followed her gaze and gave a small, uncertain smile. Across the water, sirens wailed faintly, likely emergency crews checking flooded properties. Tom stood and brushed dirt from his hands. "Lake rose nearly 8 inches overnight," he said. "Fastest surge we've seen in years." Marianne looked at the waterline markings along the dock post. It had come higher than she expected. higher than Daniel's baseline diagram had predicted, but the reinforcement had compensated. Tom's expression shifted from curiosity to something closer to respect. "You ever consider consulting?" he asked lightly. "Might have a market for shoreline stabilization." She gave a tired half-laugh. "I'm retired. For now." More neighbors trickled in throughout the morning. Some stood quietly, taking in the view. Others asked questions. What kind of sandbags she used, how she positioned the braces, whether she'd anticipated the runoff pattern. Marianne answered simply, without flourish. She did not mention fear. She did not mention the moment she nearly lost footing in the mud. She spoke of measurements and angles, of watching the wind direction and reinforcing the northern bank first. Atlas remained beside her, occasionally stepping forward to sniff at unfamiliar boots before returning to her side. By midday, the gathering thinned. People had their own damage to assess. Tom lingered. "You realize," he said slowly, looking up at the repaired porch beam, "most folks assumed this place wouldn't survive the season." "So did my son." Tom nodded once. "Well," he said, stepping back toward his truck, "turns out it's the only shoreline that didn't collapse." The phrase hung in the air. The only shoreline that didn't collapse. Marianne looked out across the lake again. The cabin still bore scars, tarp flapping lightly overhead, mud splashed along the lower boards, but it stood upright, solid, grounded. She walked slowly onto the porch and lowered herself onto the reinforced beam. Atlas joined her, resting his head on her knee. The exhaustion finally caught up to her in full. Her shoulders ached deeply. Her palms were blistered raw beneath her gloves. Her eyes burned from lack of sleep. But beneath the fatigue was something steady. Not triumph, not pride, something quieter. She had endured. A car approached mid-afternoon, different from the neighbors' trucks. Eric stepped out, jaw tight, scanning the shoreline with visible urgency. He stopped short when he saw the dock still attached. He walked toward her slowly. "I heard about the surge," he said without greeting. "I came as soon as I could." "It was rough," she replied. He looked at the trench, the sandbags, the rope securing the dock post. "You did all this last night?" "Yes." "Alone?" She didn't answer immediately. Atlas stood and moved slightly closer to her leg. Eric's eyes flicked toward the dog, then back to the cabin. Across the lake, he could see visible damage to other properties. One porch leaned dangerously toward the water. Another dock had snapped entirely free, drifting sideways. He swallowed. "You could have gotten hurt." "I didn't." "You should have called." "There was no service." He stepped onto the dock carefully, testing the boards. The rope creaked faintly, but held. He crouched near one of the braces and ran his hand along the tightened knot. "This was smart," he admitted quietly. Marianne studied him, not defensively, not expectantly, just observing. Eric stood again and turned slowly, taking in the reinforced porch beam, the tarp secured at precise angles, the reorganized woodpile. The place no longer looked abandoned. It looked intentional. "I thought," he began, then stopped. "You thought it would fail," she finished gently. He didn't deny it. Wind skimmed lightly across the lake, softer now. "I didn't want you isolated," he said after a long pause. "I'm not isolated." He glanced toward the gravel road where neighbors' tire tracks still marked the mud. "They came to check on you?" "Yes." Eric looked unsettled by that realization. Atlas stepped forward, sniffing cautiously at his shoes before sitting down between them again, not blocking, but present. Eric hesitated, then slowly reached down and let his hand hover near the dog's head. Atlas didn't pull away. He didn't lean in either. He simply watched. The silence stretched. Not tense this time, but unfamiliar. "You held," Eric said finally, glancing once more at the shoreline. So did the cabin. He exhaled slowly. Across the lake, the cleanup had begun. Boats navigating debris, voices carrying faintly over water. Eric looked at his mother differently now, not as someone in over her head, much but as someone who had stepped into it and stayed standing. I should get back, he said, though the words sounded less certain than before. Marianne nodded. He walked toward his car, then paused halfway. Mom, she looked up. Just be careful. I am. He studied her for another second, then left. Atlas returned to sit beside her on the porch. The lake had begun to recede slightly, leaving a thin line of damp earth marking how high it had climbed. Marianne leaned back against the cabin wall and closed her eyes briefly. The storm had tested more than wood and rope. It had tested belief. And for the first time since Eric placed those keys in her hand, the cabin no longer felt like something that was supposed to break her. It felt like something that had proven her. The lake receded inch by inch over the next week, and leaving behind a dark watermark on the dock posts, a quiet record of what had almost been lost. Marianne studied that line every morning, not with fear, with calculation. Daniel's notes for Phase 2 had always been ambitious. Replace warped planks, reinforce posts, extend platform for community use. She turned to that section now with a different kind of focus. The dock had survived, but survival wasn't enough. It still leaned slightly to one side. The rope brace that held during the storm looked temporary, functional but inelegant. Atlas followed her onto the dock one crisp morning as she ran her palm along the warped boards. What if we don't just fix it? She murmured. He tilted his head. What if we finish it? She returned to town that afternoon with a revised list: cedar planks, longer anchor bolts, weatherproof sealant. Tom noticed the change immediately. Upgrading now? He asked, eyebrow raised. Extending, she corrected. He studied her cart. That's a bigger commitment. She met his gaze steadily. It was always meant to be. He nodded slowly and added a small box of exterior-grade screws to her pile without comment. When she returned, the sky was a bright autumn blue, leaves along the shoreline beginning to blush gold. She started by removing the warped boards along the dock's outer edge. Each one resisted at first, nails reluctant to release their hold. Her shoulders burned with effort, but she worked in steady rhythm, pry, lift, stack. Atlas remained nearby, occasionally nudging smaller pieces aside to clear her path. By the third day, the dock's skeletal frame was exposed, posts rising from water, out crossbeams steady from her earlier reinforcement. Daniel's drawing for the community access platform lay open on the porch table, corners held down by a coffee mug and a stone. She had studied that sketch for hours the night before. It showed a widened section at the end of the dock, an octagonal platform large enough for several chairs. In the margin, he had written, "Reading platform? Marianne would love this." She traced the faded pencil line once more before heading back outside. The extension required new anchor points driven deeper into the lake bed. She worked carefully, measuring twice before drilling. The sound of the drill echoed across the quiet water. Atlas sat at the shoreline, watching the horizon as if guarding the process. The first cedar plank went down on a cool Thursday morning, and she lowered it slowly into position, aligning it with the anchor bolts. When she tightened the final screw and stepped back, the platform's shape became visible for the first time. Not large, not extravagant, but intentional. A place to sit, a place to stay. By the end of the week, the widened deck stood fully framed, boards laid evenly across the surface. She sanded rough edges by hand in the evenings, lantern light casting long shadows across the lake, the smell of cedar mixed with pine and water. One afternoon, a small pickup truck slowed at the edge of the gravel road. A young mother stepped out with two children, twins, maybe 7 years old. They hovered near the entrance, whispering. Marianne noticed them and walked up the slope toward the road. "Can I help you?" she asked gently. The mother looked slightly embarrassed. We heard about the storm and the dock. My boys wanted to see it." The twins stared at Atlas first. "Is he friendly?" one asked. "Very," Marianne replied. Atlas approached slowly, tail wagging in measured arcs. He lowered his head slightly, allowing the boys to pet him without hesitation. The mother smiled. "We homeschool," she added quietly. "The boys love being near the lake." Marianne glanced toward the newly built platform. "Would you like to see something?" she asked. The boys nodded eagerly. She led them down the path to the dock. The cedar boards glowed softly under the afternoon sun. The twins stepped carefully onto the platform. "It's like a stage," one said. "For what?" the other asked. Marianne paused. "For stories," she answered. That evening, she brought down a small crate from the cabin, books she had kept from the donation pile when the library downsized years earlier. She arranged 3 folding chairs on the new platform and set the crate between them. Atlas lay at the edge of the dock, facing outward like a sentinel. The following Saturday, the twins returned, and they brought 2 friends. Marianne read aloud from an old adventure novel, her voice steady and familiar in the open air. The lake carried her words softly across the water. The children sat cross-legged on the cedar boards, listening with quiet intensity. Atlas remained still, eyes scanning the tree line and the water, but never drifting far from her side. By the second weekend, 5 children arrived, then 7. Parents lingered at the shoreline, and surprised by the calmness of it all, the rebuilt cabin behind her, the extended platform reaching confidently into the lake. Tom stopped by one afternoon and leaned against a tree while she read. "You turned it into a gathering place," he said later. "I just added a few boards," she replied. The platform became known quietly around town. The librarian's dock. Marianne didn't advertise it. She didn't announce it. She simply opened the crate and read when children arrived. Atlas grew accustomed to the routine. He greeted newcomers with a polite sniff, then returned to his watchful post. The dock no longer leaned. It stood straight and wide, cedar boards aligned cleanly beneath autumn light. The cabin, once a ruin meant to isolate her, now faced the lake like an anchor point. One afternoon, and as she packed the books back into the crate, she looked out over the water and allowed herself a small, private smile. The storm had tested the structure. The rebuilding had transformed it. And without planning it, she had extended more than wood over water. She had extended an invitation. The first photograph was taken on a quiet Sunday afternoon. Marianne hadn't noticed at first. She was seated in a folding chair on the cedar platform, reading from a worn hardcover copy of Island of the Blue Dolphins. The lake shimmered behind her, calm and reflective. 5 children sat cross-legged on the deck, jackets zipped against the crisp air. Atlas lay stretched at her feet, chin resting on his paws, eyes half closed but alert. A young woman stood near the shoreline with a camera. "Sorry," she said when Marianne finally looked up. "I'm Claire Bennett. I write for the regional paper. I heard about the storm, and about this." She gestured toward the dock. Marianne closed the book gently. "This?" "The cabin, the shoreline, the reading program." "It's not a program," Marianne replied. "It's just Saturday." Claire smiled. "That's usually how good stories start." Atlas rose and approached cautiously. Claire knelt slightly, allowing him to sniff her hand before scratching behind his ear. "He approves," she said. Marianne watched the woman carefully. "You're not here to sensationalize anything, are you?" Claire shook her head. "No. I'm here because I've covered 3 shoreline collapses this month, and this is the only one that didn't." Marianne hesitated. The children shifted impatiently on the deck. "Can I finish the chapter first?" she asked. Claire nodded and stepped back, camera lowered. Marianne resumed reading. Her voice carried steadily over the water, the rhythm familiar and grounding. Atlas returned to his place at her feet. Afterward, Claire asked gentle questions about the storm, about the reinforcement, about Daniel's notebooks. She scribbled quickly, occasionally glancing up at the cabin as if memorizing its lines. "You rebuilt this alone?" she asked. "With help," Marianne replied, resting a hand on Atlas's back. Claire smiled at the dog. "He looks like he takes his job seriously." "He does." Before leaving, Claire snapped a final photograph. Marianne standing on the restored porch, Atlas beside her, cedar deck stretching behind them into open water. "Thank you," Claire said. "I think people need to see this." Marianne didn't think much of it afterward. She had boards to seal before winter, and a drafty window to repair in the bedroom. The article appeared 5 days later. Tom was the first to bring a copy. He pulled his truck into the gravel drive just before noon and stepped out holding the folded paper. "Your front page," he said, half amused. Marianne wiped her hands on a rag and accepted it. The headline stretched across the top. "Retired librarian rebuilds lakeside cabin alone. Saves shoreline during storm." Beneath it was the photograph Claire had taken. Marianne stood upright on the porch, hair pulled back, expression calm but firm. Atlas sat at her side, ears forward, eyes bright. The article detailed the storm surge, the erosion patterns, Daniel's unfinished plans, the reading platform. It quoted Tom, "It's the only shoreline that didn't collapse." It quoted Claire, "What began as isolation became restoration." Marianne read it twice before folding the paper carefully. "It's accurate," she said. Tom grinned. "More than accurate." By afternoon, cars began appearing more frequently along the gravel road. Not just neighbors now, people from the next town over. A retired couple curious about shoreline reinforcement. A young father who had seen the article online and wanted his daughter to attend the reading hour. Marianne felt the shift almost immediately. The cabin was no longer a quiet project hidden behind trees. It had become visible. Atlas noticed too. He remained calm but positioned himself more deliberately at the edge of the dock when unfamiliar footsteps approached. One evening, and as the sun dipped low over the lake, Marianne saw a familiar sedan pull into the drive. Eric stepped out slowly, holding a folded newspaper in his hand. He did not speak immediately. He simply stood there, looking at the porch, the cedar deck, the small group of children gathered near the shoreline. Marianne met his gaze from the dock. He walked down carefully. "I read it," he said quietly. "Yes. They quoted you." "They quoted Tom more." He held up the paper slightly. "You're trending online." She blinked. "I'm what?" He gave a faint, reluctant smile. "The article's been shared. People like comeback stories." She studied his expression. There was no irritation in it now, only something unsettled. "I didn't do it for a story," she said. "I know." He looked around again. The cabin no longer leaned. If the porch beams were straight, the deck extended confidently into the lake. Children's laughter drifted across the water. "You saved more than your own place," he added softly. She didn't respond. Eric folded the paper and slipped it into his jacket pocket. "They asked about you at work," he said. "Someone recognized the last name." Marianne arched an eyebrow. "And?" He exhaled. "I didn't know what to say." Atlas approached him slowly this time. Eric hesitated, then crouched. Atlas studied him carefully before stepping closer, allowing Eric's hand to rest briefly against his neck. The gesture was small, but different. Eric stood and glanced back toward the road. "I should go," he said. "Just be careful, with the attention." "I always am." He nodded. As his car disappeared down the gravel path, Marianne unfolded the newspaper once more. The photograph caught the light of the setting sun. She didn't recognize the woman in the image at first, not because she looked different, but because she looked steady, not abandoned, not discarded. Steady. Atlas returned to her side and sat. The lake shimmered again under the evening sky, reflecting not just water and trees, but something newly visible. Recognition. It settled over the cabin like a second roof. Cars no longer slowed out of curiosity alone. They stopped with purpose. Parents brought folding chairs. A retired teacher from town offered to donate a stack of classic novels. Someone left a thermos of hot cider on the porch one afternoon, with a note that read, "For the librarian who stayed." Marianne accepted the gestures quietly, but attention had weight. She felt it in the way conversations shifted when she walked into the hardware store, in the way Tom introduced her to customers as the one who saved the shoreline, in the way strangers looked at the dock before looking at her. Atlas sensed the shift too. He remained calm, but his posture grew subtly more protective when unfamiliar groups gathered at once. One chilly Thursday morning, as frost clung to the edges of the grass, she heard the crunch of tires on gravel again. She did not look up immediately. Visitors had become common, but Atlas did not bark. He stood, alert, but not defensive. Marianne turned toward the road. Eric stepped out of his car slowly. He was not dressed for an office this time. No pressed shirt, no polished shoes. He wore jeans and an old flannel jacket she recognized from years ago. He stood for a moment without speaking, hands shoved into his pockets, breath visible in the cold air. "Morning," she said evenly. "Morning." He walked down the slope toward the dock, eyes tracing the cedar boards, the reinforced beams, the cabin roof now properly shingled where the tarp had once flapped. "You've been busy," he said. "Yes." He stopped at the edge of the platform. "I read the follow-up," he added. "There was a follow-up?" "They called it a community revival." She almost smiled. Atlas approached Eric cautiously, tail moving in slow arcs. This time, he did not stop between them. Eric reached down and rested his hand on the dog's head without hesitation. Atlas remained still. Eric looked up at the lake. "My place flooded," he said quietly. Marianne's expression shifted. "I heard. Basement took on 4 inches. Insurance will cover most of it." He paused. "But it shook me." The admission hung there. He had always spoken in solutions, not uncertainties. "I kept thinking," he continued, eyes fixed on the water. "If you'd been there, if something like that had happened." "But I wasn't," she said gently. He nodded once. "You weren't." They stood side by side on the cedar platform Daniel had once sketched in pencil. Eric glanced down at the dock supports, examining the braces. "You anchored these deeper than standard," he observed. "Yes." He crouched to inspect one of the bolts. "Mind if I?" he asked, gesturing toward a loose plank near the far edge. Marianne stepped back slightly. "Go ahead." He removed his jacket and set it aside. His movements were slower than they used to be, or less practiced with manual tasks. He adjusted the board carefully, aligning it flush with the others before tightening the screws with steady pressure. Atlas sat nearby, watching every motion. Eric worked in silence for several minutes. Marianne did not interrupt. When he finished, he wiped his hands on his jeans and stood. "There," he said quietly. "Thank you." He looked at her then, not defensively, not critically, just looking. "I was wrong," he said finally. She didn't respond immediately. Not because she hadn't heard. Because she had. "I thought I was protecting you," he added. "I know." "I thought you needed managing." She let out a soft breath. "I needed space." The words were simple, not accusatory, not triumphant. Just true. Eric looked down at the dock again. "I underestimated you." She studied his face carefully. "You underestimated yourself, too," she said. He blinked, slightly caught off guard. Atlas rose and stepped between them, not as a barrier this time, but as a bridge. He nudged Eric's hand lightly, then rested his head briefly against Marianne's leg. Eric laughed softly under his breath. "He forgives me," he said. "He evaluates you," she corrected. The lake rippled gently, reflecting late autumn light. "I don't want you alone up here in winter," Eric said after a pause. "Not because I think you can't handle it, but because—" he hesitated. "Because I want to help." The difference in phrasing did not go unnoticed. She nodded slowly. "There's a section of the dock posts that still need reinforcing before freeze," she said. He looked at her, surprised. "Oh, you're giving me a job?" "I'm offering you one." He exhaled in a way that sounded almost like relief. "Show me." They worked side by side that afternoon. Eric struggled at first, hands unused to the strain, shoulders tight from desk work. But he did not complain. Marianne handed him tools without commentary. Atlas moved between them occasionally, watching, then settling nearby once satisfied. No formal apology passed between them. No dramatic embrace. Just measured effort. Shared weight. As the sun began to lower, casting amber light across the lake. Eric tightened the final bolt on the reinforced post. He stepped back and examined the structure. "Solid," he said. "Yes." They stood quietly for a moment. The cedar boards beneath their feet felt steady. The cabin behind them stood straight, though children's laughter echoed faintly from the path where two boys raced toward the shoreline with a stack of borrowed books. Eric glanced toward them. "You built something," he said quietly. She followed his gaze. "Yes." He picked up his jacket. "I'll come back next weekend," he added. "If that's all right?" She nodded once. "It is." Atlas walked him halfway up the slope toward the car. This time, when Eric reached down, Atlas leaned into his touch. The gesture was small, but earned. Marianne remained on the dock long after the car disappeared. The lake was calm again, not because it had not risen, but because it had. And they had held. Winter arrived softly that year, not with a sudden blizzard or violent freeze, but with a slow settling of frost across the shoreline, on a thin lace of ice forming at the edges of the lake each morning. By the time the first true snowfall came, the cabin no longer resembled the structure Eric had once described as barely standing. The roof had been fully reshingled before the deep cold set in. The porch beams stood straight and square. The windows were sealed properly, light glowing warm behind the glass each evening. The cedar platform at the end of the dock had been treated and weatherproofed. Reinforced posts now disappeared deep into the lakebed, braced for the freeze. And the path from the gravel road to the shoreline had been cleared and leveled, lined with small solar lanterns that flickered to life at dusk. Eric returned nearly every weekend. At first, he came with tools and questions. Later, he came with thermoses of coffee and quiet presence. Yet he no longer corrected her measurements. He asked for them. Atlas adjusted easily to the new rhythm, greeting Eric at the road, walking beside him down to the dock, occasionally resting his head against the man's knee while they worked. The apology that had never been spoken lingered only as memory. In its place stood shared labor. By early spring, the lake thawed completely. Snow receded into damp earth, and the cedar deck glowed richly under returning sunlight. Marianne stood one morning on the porch, surveying the view. Children's laughter drifted up from the platform below. The reading hours had continued through winter, relocated temporarily inside the cabin where she'd arranged chairs around a small cast-iron stove Eric had installed. Now they were back outside. The deck no longer felt like an extension, and it felt like the center. Tom Alvarez pulled his truck into the gravel drive just before noon, followed by several other vehicles. He stepped out with an expression she couldn't quite read. "What's all this?" she asked. "You didn't think we'd let this go unnoticed?" he replied. Behind him, neighbors gathered quietly, parents, children, even a few unfamiliar faces from neighboring towns. Claire Bennett stood near the front, camera hanging from her neck again. "What's happening?" Marianne asked cautiously. Tom cleared his throat. "We're calling it a shoreline celebration," he said. "You turned what was supposed to be a last stop into a starting point." She shook her head faintly. "I just rebuilt a cabin." Claire stepped forward gently. "Oh, you rebuilt more than that." A small wooden sign was carried down toward the dock by two of the twins who had first visited months ago. They placed it at the entrance to the cedar platform. Carved neatly into the wood were the words, "Keller Reading Dock." Marianne inhaled sharply. "That wasn't necessary," she said softly. "Neither was what you did," Tom replied. Eric stood off to the side, hands in his pockets, watching her reaction carefully. Atlas trotted down to inspect the sign, sniffing it with solemn approval before sitting beside it as if claiming it officially. Laughter rippled through the gathered crowd. The lake shimmered under clear spring light, reflecting not just water and sky, but faces that had once assumed the cabin would collapse. Faces that had watched her drive north alone, but faces now standing in quiet respect. Marianne stepped onto the platform slowly. The cedar boards felt firm beneath her feet. Children gathered in front of her, holding books. Parents lingered near the shoreline. Eric approached quietly and stood beside her, not ahead, not behind. Beside. Tom spoke briefly about storm resilience. Claire snapped photographs. But the most powerful moment came in silence. When the murmurs faded, when the breeze carried only the soft sound of water against wood. Marianne looked across the lake, the same lake that had risen violently months before. Then she looked at the cabin behind her, then at her son, then at Atlas, steady and content at her feet. She had stood on her front lawn months ago, watching movers carry away what she thought was her foundation. She had felt discarded, unwanted, sent away. Yet here she stood, not removed from life, but rooted deeper into it. The town had expected the cabin to break her. Instead, it had revealed her. She cleared her throat gently. "I didn't plan any of this," she said simply. "I only followed what was already here." Her gaze drifted briefly toward Daniel's notebooks, resting safely inside the cabin. "And I kept going." There were no dramatic cheers, no applause that shattered the quiet. Only something stronger. Stillness. A collective pause of recognition. Even the children seemed to sense it, standing a little taller on the deck. Eric leaned slightly closer. "I'm proud of you," he said under his breath. The words carried more weight than any headline ever could. She glanced at him, surprised not by the statement, but by how naturally it landed. Atlas shifted, the tail sweeping once across the boards. The lake rippled gently, sunlight dancing across its surface.
Sometimes what feels like abandonment is not an ending, but a redirection. Sometimes the place meant to isolate you becomes the place where you rediscover your strengths. And when others underestimate what you can endure, persistence speaks louder than argument ever could. Marianne did not feel vindicated, she felt steady. The cabin stood strong behind her, the dog dressed confidently into open water. And the town, once certain she had been sent away, now stood quietly, speechless before what she had built. Sometimes the place we are sent to at the last resort becomes the place where we finally stand on your own. Marianne didn't argue her way back into dignity. She built it, board by board, until even the town had to pause and lock again. If you were in her place, would you have stayed and rebuild or walk away? Tell me honestly in the comments. And if stories like this remind you what trends doesn't retire with age, consider subscribing. There's always another quiet comeback way to be told.